Okay, folks, measuring equipment. Measuring equipment is pretty simple. Bottom line is, when you think about measuring, we have to measure length. When we measure length, we tend to measure length with a meter stick. When we measure volume, we tend to do volume with a graduated cylinder. And when we're doing mass, we tend to use a triple beam balance, or potentially an electronic scale. Right? Either one will work just fine. Right? So you'll notice I haven't circled a couple things. You never, ever, 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 ever use a beaker to measure something. In a volumetric flask, you tend to use a volumetric flask for mixing things, like, for example, if you're diluting an acid, right? But you tend to not use a volumetric flask to measure a volume unless it's a very precise volume that you need. Right? And again, the typical time when you do that is when you're diluting an acid or making a specific molarity of acid. Right? And we'll talk about that later. Right? So, I need to measure the length of a pencil. That means I'm going to use a meter stick. Right? And I need to measure the mass of a pencil. Right? Well, that will be the triple beam balance. All right? Or potentially an electronic scale, if you've got one. Okay? You need to measure the volume. Well, when we have a volume, what we do is we measure the volume using a graduated cylinder. Well, how does a cylinder help us measure the volume of a rock? Right? Well, in all honesty, the easiest way to do that is you take a graduated cylinder and you put some water in it, and you measure how high the water is. You drop the rock in it, and you measure how high the water went up to. And whatever that difference is, that's the volume of the rock. Okay? So you use a graduated cylinder. And finally, you need to determine the density of a particular piece of metal. What two pieces of equipment would you use to accomplish the task? Well, knowing its length doesn't help you. What is density? Density is mass over volume. So how do I figure out the mass? Sure, we use a triple beam balance. And how do we figure out the volume? Well, use a graduated cylinder. Right? Don't use a meter stick, use a graduated cylinder. So those two pieces of equipment will help you go and figure out the density. All right, I think that's it. I'll see you in class. If you have questions, let me know.